Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the Extra Mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now, your host, Jackson Mummy, owner of the Celebration Bar Review.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 271 of the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. This is your host, Jackson Mummy, feeling a little froggy. I've got a bit of a cold in my throat today, so I apologize for that. I thought I'd try and offset that a little bit with the calm, soothing waters of Florida in the background here, at least for a few minutes. And I also thought that was appropriate because the focus of the first part of today's podcast is going to be to talk about Florida bar results from July 2019. They've just been released. This is our first take and first look at the numbers. So we're going to give you some information there, tell you a little bit about what's going on. Even if you're not a Florida bar taker, you want to stick around and listen to that or watch it, because Florida is the first large jurisdiction in the country to release their results. It tells us a little bit about what's coming typically. I call it the canary in the coal mine. It generally gives us an insight as to what we're going to see in New York and California, Texas, some other large states. So stick around. We're going to talk about those results in just a few minutes. The other part of today's podcast episode is probably less optimistic. I did recorded a message a few years ago and updated several times since then. One of the most popular messages, weirdly enough, is what to do, 5 things to do if you failed the bar exam. And unfortunately, it continues to be a classic because so many people fail the bar exam. And I thought that today, as we're starting to get results out, not just from Florida, but from a series of smaller jurisdictions around the country as well, that it's probably useful to repeat that recording for you today, talking about if you fail the exam, what to do. It's the worst feeling in the world. There's no doubt about it, but it's not the end of the world. And there are some very productive and useful things you can do right after you find out that you failed the exam. And I wanted to offer that message today for those who are just getting results and they're not favorable. Now, if you have not yet taken the bar and you're saying, wow, what a downer, I don't want to hear that. That's okay. I understand. You don't have to listen. But I think it's useful to get a sense of what that process is like if you get your results and they're not favorable. And I know we've got a lot of you waiting on results in states like New York and California, Georgia, Texas, New Jersey, DC, lots of other places. And you may be thinking, well, that would be bad luck for me to listen. But it's really not. I really want you to just listen and know what might be coming. We'll hope for good results for everybody. But if they're not favorable results, you really need to know what to do when those numbers come out. And so I hope that message will be useful to you. Now, if this is your first time on the podcast, you're probably thinking, what the heck is going on here? We come to you every week to talk about all things bar exam related. And of course, we're right in the midst of the results season coming up and starting also to gear up for February 2020 exams. And so regardless of where you are in that process, we're glad you found us. This podcast is provided in a couple of different formats. If you prefer to watch the video, you can do that by going to celebrationbarreview.com/271. That's the episode number. If you'd rather listen to the podcast, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, on iHeartRadio, on Spotify, and almost any place that podcasts are syndicated. And we have all of our prior episodes of the podcasts on our website. Just go to celebrationbarreview.com, click on the tab for case studies, and you'll see a link to the podcasts. So lots of different ways to get that information. And again, we try to come to you every week about this time with the latest on the bar exam. Now, before we jump into the Florida results information, I want to just let you know that this podcast is being brought to you by our special free webinar training. It's called Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. This is a look at what you have to do in order to pass the bar. It's a step-by-step roadmap. We go through 4 steps that successful students follow, and we take a lot of case studies and let you hear from these students in their own words, and I think it's incredibly valuable. We've been doing this webinar for years. We updated it just recently to add all new case studies, lots of new information, and I really think it's terrific and incredibly valuable for you to attend. It is completely free, and it's designed for you to watch at the date and time that's most convenient for you. All you have to do is to register, and you can do that in the show notes for the podcast or by going to celebrationbarreview.com/webinar. Sign up for the date and time that's most convenient for you, and then check out Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. All right, I don't want to keep you waiting any longer. Let's talk about Florida results. And the headline is going to be across the country that the pass rate went up in Florida. And I'm of two minds about this. I'm always excited when pass rates go up. That is always a good thing. The problem, however, is that there's a fair amount of statistical manipulation going on here. So let me give you the numbers and then let me break it down a little bit differently and show you where we really are. Here's what the headline writers will say. The pass rate for first-time takers in Florida went up to 74%, which is great. It's up from 67% last year. And it's a 6.7% jump from last July's results. And it's up from the 71.3% pass rate from July of 2017. So that's good news. We always like to see people passing the bar. First-time takers who are taking the exam and passing at about a 74% pass rate, that is a good number. It's not great. I can remember times when the pass rates in Florida were in the upper 80 percentile. But in this day and age, 74% is not bad at all. Now, there's a couple of interesting things that you need to understand about how Florida reports results and how the law schools in Florida specifically report results. The first thing that's important to keep in mind is that Florida law schools, not all of them, but some of them have an interesting game that they play, and that is that they hold students out after graduation for one exam, either through jobs or stipends or special programs, and then let them take the exam for their first time, second time around for their class. These are at-risk bar takers. And the reason that the law schools do this is that they're not counted as first-time takers. So if I graduated in middle of the year last year and could have sat for the February 2019 exam but didn't, and my first time taking the exam was July of 2019, it's actually reported as not being a first-time taker for the results that the examiners release. So that's one thing you've got to understand. This is a fairly selected group of students taking the exam. Now, there were 2,066 first-time takers this summer. That is down from 2,228 people in July of 2018. Now, why is that number dropping? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is some people are just getting discouraged and leaving the jurisdiction. But the other reason is that exactly what I just described. You have some people that the law schools themselves are saying, we think you're at risk to not pass the exam, so we're going to have you sit out an additional exam. And that may be good to do, but it skews these numbers just a little bit. So I want you to be cautious of that. That's the first thing to understand. The second thing to understand is that Florida, uniquely among bar jurisdictions in the country, reports only the first-time taker pass rate. They do not report the repeat bar taker pass rate until the National Conference of Bar Examiners statistics are released a year later. So what that means is I now have, and we have, the February and July 2018 repeat bar taker pass rates in Florida, but we don't have anything from 2019. Now, we can extrapolate because in 2018, the repeat bar taker pass rate was 22% in February and 20% in July. What that means is that if we extrapolate that same 20% to this exam, we get some very interesting numbers. And here's what I mean by that. There were a total of 3,162 test takers. As I said, 2,066 were first-time takers, so roughly 1,000 repeat bar takers. If we assume the same 20% pass rate that we had a year ago, and it's reasonable to assume that that number has been very low, but it's been pretty consistent the last few years, that means we had 200 approximately those repeat takers that passed their exam. When we take those 200 students and we add them to the people who passed who are first-time takers, what happens is that our overall pass rate now goes to 54%. That's the number I think you really want to be looking at. 54% of all the bar takers in Florida in July passed. Now that's very different than hearing 74%. It's a 20% difference, and it's really a reflection of the repeat bar takers. Now here's another interesting thing about the number of repeat bar takers. In July of 2018, there were 600 repeat bar takers on the Florida exam. In July of 2019, there were 1,000 repeat bar takers. In other words, that population grew by 40% in a single year. Why? Because so many people failed the exam. What we're seeing is basically a dichotomy. It's a split between the haves and have-nots. The people who are coming out of law school, the 3 Ls, 4 Ls, are generally doing okay. Not great, but okay. But the people who are not coming out and passing right away are getting further and further behind. And that group, that cohort, is growing. The number of people who are coming out and not passing each exam is actually growing. And because of that growth, what we're seeing is a drag on the overall pass rate. Now, the July pass rates across the country are always better than the February pass rates, not because of the difficulty of the exam, but because of the mix of people taking the test. What that probably means for February 2020 is, again, a much lower pass rate. I would expect the overall rate in Florida, February 2020, to be below 50%. If we're at 54% in a July exam overall, that is not a good number. It's not a good sign. And so when you read all of the information about all the people that passed and how great things are and how much the scores went up, that's all wonderful. But you need to recognize that the overall number of 54% is still pretty awful. And what that means in practical terms is this. If you took the Florida bar exam and failed in July of 2019, you're in good company. Lots of people failed. But you don't have the luxury of waiting very long to get back in and start your studies. You need to begin right away because, in essence, you're competing for those 20% of passing slots that the examiners seem to have allocated to repeat bar takers. And because the number of repeat bar takers is growing with each exam, that is getting more and more challenging to find your way into the passing group. So that's one of the reasons that I really wanted to link this up to today's message about what to do if you found out you failed. As much as it hurts, as terrible and awful as it is, whether you're in Florida or somewhere else, you don't have the luxury of sitting in your misery and despair for very long. You need to get underway as soon as possible. And by that, I mean literally today, right now. I know that's hard to hear, but I think it's important. Now, there's a couple of other numbers about Florida that I want to just briefly let you know. The first-time takers who went to law school outside of Florida, about 61% of those passed. So again, one of the things that happens is that the non-Florida law schools don't play that same statistical game. So there you see the big difference in numbers. And then for lawyers from other states who wanted to be licensed in Florida, their pass rate was 74%. That's a pretty good number, and that comports with what we're seeing among our students. So I think that on the whole, when I look at our first-time takers, our pass rate seems to be about consistent with what the state is saying. And when I look at our repeat bar takers, we are doing better than 20%. But no doubt, it is a difficult exam and hard for people to pass. So that's what we know about Florida at this moment. And as we get more information, we'll share it with you. One final note I want to make about the Florida exam. I had spoken previously a couple of times about the, I think what I call the tone deaf approach to the essays that they took. There were a couple of essays on this exam that I thought were really inappropriate, and I've heard from other people around the country who agree with that assessment. One of the questions was really a thinly disguised abortion question. The other was a statutory rape question. They seemed really highly inappropriate for the bar exam and really could have triggered a lot of reactions among students. In fact, I heard from people who felt triggered by the questions. And I don't have any doubt that this had an impact on scores as well. So I'm concerned about that, and we're going to continue to keep that in our focus and sights. But it's something I think you need to be aware of. Florida seems to be taking a, I don't know, a 2020 approach to, anything goes these days. And so we can ask any question we want on any topic we want. It's sort of the nature of the politics, perhaps, here in this state. But in any event, it's something I think you should be aware of. Anything goes, any kind of question can happen, and that's the deal. Now, as we start to get the results back from students and we see the specifics, we'll have more details for you, and I'll be glad to share those with you in upcoming episodes of the podcast. As far as other jurisdictions around the country that released results last week, we got results out of Nebraska, Idaho, Washington State, among others. There were a few more coming out. No big jurisdictions. The next big jurisdiction probably will be New York, and I got a lot of questions this week about when would New York release results. Well, New York doesn't have a specific date to give results. They play kind of a game of release, and I would expect, historically, these results have come out mid to late October. But the New York examiners have gotten faster and faster the better they've gotten acquainted with the UBE. And I would not be surprised if we get New York results the first week in October. So I'm watching for that. I kind of get a spidey sense, I guess, when the results are about to come out. So we'll see what happens. After the New York results, we typically see the New Jersey results. We'll see some other fairly large UBE jurisdictions, and then we will have Texas. And then later in November, we should see Georgia and California and DC, among others. So that's what we know. The numbers in the UBEs so far, we just don't have any big jurisdictions to give us an overall content. As we shared with you last week, the overall multi-state score went up by 1.6 points. That's good news. But again, that represents what first-time takers did primarily, and that skews those numbers a bit. So it's something to be aware of as you consider all these numbers. Okay, well, if your head isn't spinning now from all the numbers and statistics and analysis, good for you. Now what I want to do is transition and really get to the meat of today's episode. We know that when people fail the exam, it is one of the worst moments that they can have, but it doesn't have to be the end for you. It really can be the beginning. And so in this week's message, we want to talk about 5 things you can do if you found out that you failed your exam. Today, we're going to be talking about 5 things that you should be doing if you find yourself in the position where you've failed the bar exam. Now, results are starting to come out over the next few weeks around the country, and I know that there are going to be a significant number of people who will fail their exams, and I want to make sure that you have some idea of what to do. If you've gotten your results as you're listening or watching this, there's certainly some steps that you can take right now, and I want to outline for you today 5 specific things that I think could make a difference for you if you did fail your bar exam. We're going to go through each one of those, and I hope you'll listen and take some notes and use this information to your own best benefit. First thing that I think is important to say about failing the bar exam is that when we talk about failing the exam, there is a distinction to be made between failing the test and actually being a failure. I recognize that many people equate those two things. They'll say to themselves, well, I failed the test, therefore I am a personal failure. And I want to be really clear about this. That is absolutely, unequivocally not so. I think in any other context we would recognize that, but because the bar exam is such a high-stakes test, it's easy to confuse those two things. And so you start feeling like you're a failure, and you really begin to feel that in your insides. It's important, if you feel that way, to talk to someone else about it, and you get it out of your system, because it's debilitating when it comes to your ability to be successful in the future. But it can also impact the quality of your life, the quality of your relationships, the quality of your work. And so I just want to overview with that if you failed the bar, what it means is that for a day or 2 days or 3 days, when you sat for a test, you simply did not perform in a way that some third party arbitrarily decided was insufficient or not good enough. It doesn't really mean anything about your personal success or your personal ability. And in point of fact, if you were good enough to get to the bar exam, that is, to get through law school, then you're good enough to pass the bar exam, and you're really a success by most measures in the world. It's just for those specific days you didn't reach the threshold or the bar. Now, with that thought in mind, and I know that's a lot to absorb and take in, but I want to give you 5 strategies for things you should be doing now that you've found out that you failed. And I want to talk about each one of those specific items. The first thing that we want to talk about here is the notion of what to do if you fail, and the first thing you have to do is to grieve it. Now, what I mean by grieving it is that you need to have the ability to just emotionally let go. You have to be able to say, this is really awful, it feels terrible, and you've got to give yourself the opportunity to grieve it and get through that process. For some people, that means really long cries. For other people, it's walks in the wood, maybe somewhere in upstate New York. For some people, it will be screaming and yelling. For other people, it's just getting away from everyone else. Ultimately, though, the goal here is that you understand and begin to recognize that you've just got to let it out. If you hold this feeling inside, you're going to have a real problem. It's going to build up, and ultimately it's going to explode. And the problem is much like this sneeze that I'm about to have one day. It just blows up, and you're like, oh my God, there's that sneeze, and then it's bad. So you you want to make sure that you let go of this feeling. It's going to happen, and it's going to happen at an inopportune time and in an inopportune way. So the first thing that I want you to do is give yourself the opportunity, just as you would in any traumatic situation or any bad situation. You've got to be able to grieve what happened. And the truth is we all grieve differently, and there's no one right way to do this. And some people would say, oh, you're just overreacting. Why are you so upset? It's just a test. And yet other people, I think, clearly would recognize what a critical test this is and how much is at stake. And so there's really no one right way or single way that you go through that grief process, but you still have to go through it. Now, I'm worried when I encounter bar takers who failed, who say, well, I'm stoic, I'm not going to respond to this at all. And at that moment, I think they're being absolutely truthful and correct. But ultimately, at some stage, it will come back and there will be an impact. And one of the things that we want to avoid here is the equivalent of post-traumatic stress disorder, because those things tend to appear, those symptoms appear when stress comes back up later. And as you're studying and retaking and sitting for the bar exam, that's obviously the moment when that unresolved grief can jump up and grab you, causing enormous stress and anxiety. And so you want to give yourself a little bit of time. What that really means in practical terms is if you get your results on a Friday, give yourself the weekend to grieve. If you get your results on a Monday, give yourself till the middle of the week, 2, 3, 4 days to get through that process before you start making significant decisions about what you're going to do next. All right, so item number 2 is that you have to do first things first. You have to do the things that are necessary because you have to forgive yourself. And so the second step is to forgive yourself. And what I mean by forgiving yourself is really very simple. When you fail the bar, it feels like, as I said at the beginning, a personal failure, like you are a failure. But beyond that, many bar takers, in my experience, start to blame themselves. They start to feel as though they're insufficient in some significant way. For example, I'll hear things like, well, I didn't study hard enough, or I didn't study properly, or I used the wrong bar review, or I studied the wrong materials, or I didn't focus on this part of the exam, or I didn't spot the 8 issues that somebody told me were going to be on the test, whatever it might be. And as a result, we tend to carry those things like burdens, and we carry them with us all the time. The reality of that is that many people end up in a circumstance in which they literally can't figure out what to do next, and they're stuck. So this second step is critically important. You need to forgive yourself. You have to let go of whatever happened, whether it was right or wrong, or whether you think that worked or didn't work. You need to let go of it. You need to forgive the errors that you might have made. Maybe they were errors, but maybe not. It's okay either way. The danger of not forgiving yourself is that there's a tendency then to become defensive about what you did, to say in effect, well, I'm not going to forgive myself, so I'm going to claim that everything I did was right and perfect, and therefore my result, my failure, was everyone else's fault. We call that the blame game. It's very dangerous to do that. And I want to encourage you that if you get a failing result, be kind to yourself. Be gentle with yourself as you go through. Remember, step number 1 was the grieving process. But you also have to recognize that the tendency in step 2 will be to blame yourself along with a lot of other people or entities. You'll blame the bar examiners. You'll blame your law school. You'll blame the American Bar Association. You'll blame your bar review. You'll blame me, whatever it might be. But the reality is that all of that is really just covering for blaming yourself at a deeper level. And so if you don't forgive yourself, it's impossible to move forward. And when I see people who are really stuck in that ongoing rut where they keep doing the same things over and over again, one of the reasons for that is that they haven't forgiven themselves. They're literally wallowing in the same sense of despair and self-loathing and unhappiness with what they did. Did you do everything right? Well, probably not, but it doesn't mean you did everything wrong either. And I think it's really important that you give yourself a little bit of chance of time to go through that process. Get over it. I suppose lapsed Catholics really appreciate this, but the idea of going to confession, to confess your sins, you get over it, you forgive yourself, you accept the forgiveness and you move on. That's analogous to what we're talking about here. So item number 2 is to forgive yourself. Item number 1, go ahead and grieve the process. Number 3 in our list, so I suppose is probably for those of you that are a bit more rational and stoic. And number 3 steps that we want to do is to do a non-emotional evaluation of what really happened. Now, what do I mean by this? This non-emotional evaluation simply is an opportunity or an exercise in which you sit down with a piece of paper and a pen or your digital device, whatever it might be, and you make a list of things that went well for you as you studied and took the bar, and the things that did not go well. Now, if you've been in any of my webinars or watched my materials, you know that I believe and teach what's called the success-based approach to learning, which we find is much more useful than the failure or problem-based approach to learning. What I would recommend here is that you use the success-based approach. You see, no matter what score you received, we would ask the question, why was that bar exam score so high? Now, I know you're saying, wait a minute, Jackson, you've got the wrong video here. I failed. So shouldn't we be asking why it was so low? No, not really. We should ask why it's so high. Why did you get a 134 and not a 130 or a 120 or a 110 or whatever the numbers might be in your situation? We want to find out what you did well, and what is it about your performance that gave you that score and not a lower score. Once you've figured that out, you can begin to evaluate where your strengths are and where you need to continue working. But it's been my experience that when a student ignores their strengths and they focus entirely on the things that didn't work, that they're putting themselves in a deep hole. And one of the ways to get out of that deep hole is to do this non-emotional evaluation. What was good about your studies? And you might say, well, I put in this many hours, I studied consistently. I learned a lot about these subjects. I realized that there were some areas where I didn't know much about the law going in, and so on. And you begin to build on those things that you did. Then you can ask what wasn't so good about your studies. And you might say, well, I borrowed somebody else's bar review books, or I didn't study until about 4 weeks before the exam, or I was distracted, or I was afraid, and so I tried to memorize at the last minute and recite elements of the law. Being able to non-emotionally evaluate those things is really helpful. What's the best way to do that? Well, it's writing it down. Make a list, look at it, but don't judge it. Just look at it. Simply accept that there are some things you did that were good, some things that probably weren't so good. And if you can get the non-emotional evaluation in your mind, you're going to find it's a whole lot easier to begin to assess what was actually positive for you and what now needs to be corrected. You see, what I find so often is that people only do one side of the evaluation. They only look at what went wrong. That's the problem-based approach to learning. And frankly, I come across a lot of people who come to our course who have taken what I call one of the big box bar reviews, and they failed, and they say, well, here's everything that was wrong. And there's a part of me, and I'm not going to lie, there's a part of me that feels pretty smug about that when I hear that, and I want to say, well, I could have told you all that. But I also know that there were some things, even in the big box bar review, that went right. And the difficulty is that if this particular student is not considering what went right, they're putting themselves in a trap. And I hate to see that happen to anyone. So I want to encourage you to avoid that trap whenever possible. Just make the list and then evaluate it. Now, this list may take you a day or 2 or 3, maybe as you go through that grieving process. And so it's helpful to keep the list with you for a few days and pull it out when you're feeling a little bit less emotional about the results, perhaps when you can talk about them, review them, and not find yourself getting choked up. But then at whatever point that happens for you, look at the list. What was good? What wasn't good? Resolve to work on the things that are strengths to make them better strengths, and then not to focus exclusively on the weaknesses. You want to improve the weaknesses, no doubt about that, but you don't want to focus exclusively on them, and that's why I want you to do this non-emotional list. It's really an easy step. I think in the aftermath of the bar exam, it's easy to feel like everything was wrong, everything was bad. Therefore, I'm no good, I can't do it, I'm bad. We're back up to the very start about you being a failure, and that's the worst thing you can be doing. So that's our third step. It's a non-emotional evaluation. All right. The fourth thing you should be doing if you get into the situation where you find yourself having failed the bar, and it's very simple, but I know it's going to be a tough one for some of you, and here it is. You need to get restarted now. Restart now. Some of you are going to say, well, wait a minute, you told me I needed time to recover. And I mean, yeah, you needed a day or 2, but you don't need a month, you don't need 6 weeks, you don't need 6 months. And I understand that as much as I've talked about grieving and forgiving yourself and doing this non-emotional evaluation, you're going to need a few days to do that. But literally, that's a few days, not a few weeks or a few months. Now, in the beginning of the results cycle, it's easy to have the sense, it's a false sense of luxury that you can take some time before you get restarted. That is a huge mistake. You should begin right away. It's an advantage to you if you're sitting for the bar in a jurisdiction like Florida or some of the early UBE states that get their results out early. Unfortunately, if you're in a jurisdiction like California or Georgia that gets their results out very late, you don't get that luxury at all. But either way, no matter when your results came out, you need to get restarted now. Some people will be saying, when I say that, to themselves, they'll be saying, I really feel like I need to sit out an exam and I need to understand the reasoning behind the test and I need to learn everything. I'm going to wait an exam and come back. Now, sometimes that's a legitimate reason. Someone may say, I'm an accountant. I can't take time away during the particular tax season to take the bar. Or another person would say, I've got significant family requirements, or there's a wedding going on, or a baby coming, or something else that's certainly going to make it difficult, if not impossible, to sit for the next exam. But outside those sorts of unusual externalities, I would say that my advice is to sit for the next bar exam. Absolutely take the next exam. So for the next bar exam, you've got the momentum of the studies that you've just done, you have the momentum of the work and what you've learned. I found that the materials, relatively speaking, are going to be fresh in your mind, no matter where you studied or who you studied with. And so it's to your advantage to take the next bar exam. Sometimes people ask, well, is it better to take a July test or a February test because of pass rates? The reality is it makes no difference at all. The test is exactly the same. The pass rates only vary because of who's taking the test. So it's rarely to your advantage to sit out and wait. And really what you're doing, if you think about it, is you're putting the entire bar study process on hold and still like that basket of bad stuff over your head. It's sitting out there over you for a full year from where you are right now. And I think that's a really difficult process for that period of time to wait to take the exam a year from now and then wait for results after that. And so here we are a year from today just finding out if you can move on with this significant part of your life. I honestly believe that if you start right after you get your results, you'll have enough time to prepare for the exam, particularly if you're using our course. Practically speaking, you need about 250 to 300 hours. If you're a retaker, it's really on the low end. It's closer to the 250 hours. So most people will have enough time even if they're getting their results late in the season. In my experience, this is absolutely manageable. And even with those late test result dates, you can still stay at about 20 hours a week of study. So for those of you that have been told or believe that you have to study 3 or 4 or 5 or 600 hours to prepare for the exam, empirically that's not true. It's absolutely not necessary, and you don't need to buy into that approach. There's no real reason behind it. What's happening there is that what most people are doing is asking you to memorize. And as I've written and talked about and videoed about, memorization is the least effective way to study. It's the most time-consuming, and the examiners don't reward that behavior. So if you get away from memorization, and if you use an approach to learning like our spaced and stepped repetition package, this is simply learning in small pieces, and then repeating that and learning the way we're naturally wired to learn. As children, we learn by repetition, not by memorization. So you'll have the advantage of learning that way, and you're going to get a much better result. It's hard to get back in and start all over again, particularly if you think, oh my gosh, I've got 4 or 5 or 600 hours of study ahead of me. And the truth is, you really don't need to do that. But the other truth about all this is that the longer you wait, if you choose to sit out, the harder it is to go back. You know, there's a reason that some of these great aphorisms exist. You know, the one about you got to get back on the horse right away. Well, yeah, the reason for that is that fear builds, and the longer you wait, the more the fear grows. And I can tell you that virtually every week I talk to someone who's taken a bar exam and then waited. They sat out thinking they would sit out 1 exam or maybe 2, but it turned into years, 3, 4, 5, 10, or in many cases 20 years. And now they're coming back to me because it's an unfulfilled item in their life. You know, I don't really know anyone that wants to be in that position if they can avoid it. So my 4th step then is to get started now. It's a critical step, I think, for moving ahead. All right. Well, now we're ready to talk about the 5th step, which is don't repeat the same errors. Oh, this is a big one, a real big one. I spoke to somebody recently who was in one of my webinars, and she heard me say, I was actually quoting the financial guru, Dave Ramsey, and he was talking about the stinky diaper conundrum. You know, the one that says, well, it's warm and smelly, but it's mine, and I'm just going to sit here. You know, I think the same thing is true of the bar exam sometimes. we tend to become very protective of the warm, stinky mess that we make when we're studying. Now, this is not a contradiction to my point number 2 about forgiving yourself. In fact, it really goes hand in hand with it. Because if you forgive yourself, what you're doing is giving yourself permission to change what you're doing, to change the approach that you're taking. If you were studying with a big box bar review, maybe you should look at a smaller, more personalized course like ours. If you were studying with us and you fail, maybe you should look at some of the different resources that we offer. Things like PhotoReading or personal mentoring or the Paraliminal package or the audio meditations. Any of those things that might enhance or help target your studies. Those might be more valuable and it might be more helpful to get more conference time, more personal assistance. Those would all be useful things for you to do. In other words, don't just keep repeating the same process over and over again without changes. And that's the great danger. You're not learning and growing. You know, every time you take the exam, you have the opportunity to learn and grow, even if you fail. If you're trying new things, you'll have a decidedly better chance of being successful than if you simply keep repeating the same process over and over again. So when someone comes to me and says, well, you know, Jackson, I failed the bar exam, and I had failed, let's say, the Cal bar, 3 times. It's not with us. They were taking another course. And for the rest of the conversation, this person who had failed proceeded to tell me all the things that they knew about the bar exam. They were really very thoughtful. They had really obviously put a lot of effort and information into this, but everything they told me was empirically, statistically, and factually wrong. It wasn't alternative facts, it was lack of facts. And no matter how hard I tried to explain to the student that their understanding of the scoring and their understanding of how to study and their understanding of the test and that there were other approaches and that the things they were saying were not correct statements empirically, just I think convinced them even more that they were correct. And you know, in this day and age, this whole idea of alternative facts is really bizarre to me, but I see it even in the bar exam. There are people that just believe things that aren't true. And they were convinced that all they had to do was keep studying the same way and incrementally they would get better. And finally, I said to this particular person, I think if you're going to just keep doing what you've done the last 3 times, you really don't need our course. But more than that, unfortunately, more likely than not, you're going to fail again. And the statistics say that. And you'll keep failing until you do something different. You know, I don't care who you study with, but you've got to do something different, even within the context of what you're doing. And if you simply keep repeating the same process and just trying to study a little more or memorize a little more or issue spot a little more, really what happens is you're going to get about the same result. You see, the bar exam is designed to take the same inputs and return the same output every single time. And the bar examiners are very proud of their ability to do that. And I think for a lot of people, that's really a major intellectual challenge, an emotional challenge as well, because they get stuck on repeat and they just keep churning and churning and churning, doing the same thing over and over again, and the results never change. So one of the things I think you absolutely have to do if you fail the bar, after you've done that non-emotional evaluation in step number 3, is start asking yourself, what can I do differently now? I forgive myself for the mistakes I might have made, but what can I do differently this time? Could I look at taking a different bar review? Or if I want to stay with the same bar review, could I change the level of service? Or could I add features or benefits or programs that might assist me, that might get me through some of the things that are problematic? Can I build on my strengths and do more of those? Do I need to make changes in what I'm doing? Do I need to request accommodations from the bar examiners for some particular reason? Maybe I should look at switching jurisdictions and find a better jurisdiction for me and my skills, or maybe one that's got a lower cut score. Whatever those things are, you should be looking at them. But for goodness sake, don't keep repeating the same process over and over again. Well, those are the things that I think that you need to do after you've gotten a failing result. It's not an easy list. You need to grieve, you need to forgive yourself, you need to do that non-emotional evaluation, you need to get started now, and finally you've got to commit to not making the same errors as you work through your studies now that you did in the past. In my experience, that's the best way to assure that you'll get a different result on the next bar exam when you don't do those things. And I think that if you don't, you're putting yourself at the risk of getting the result that you don't want over and over again. We talk about making the next bar exam your last bar exam. That's not just a slogan or a phrase. It happens by doing these 5 things first. I know it's hard to talk about failing the exam, It's hard to think about it before the results come out, if you're watching this before your results have come out. But I'll tell you, it's really tough after the results come out if you're someone who's failed the test. But if you take to heart what I've said today, I can tell you that it's made a huge difference, and I've worked with people in every exam who've done exactly these 5 things, and they've turned their failing results into passing results. And that's what I want for you. I hope that you'll consider these items, take them to heart, put them to work and to action, and that we'll see your name on the pass results in the very near future. Podcast for this week. I hope that you found it useful. If you were a Florida bar taker, we hope your results were favorable. If they weren't, I hope you take to heart what we've just been talking about. And if you took the exam somewhere else and your results weren't favorable, of course, the same applies there. If you're taking the exam in 2020, either because you have to retake the exam or because it's your first time taking the exam, I just want to quickly remind you that we've got a free webinar. It's called Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. So look at the 4 steps that successful takers follow in order to pass their test. And we really encourage you to watch it. You can set the date and time at your own convenience, but you do need to register, and you can do that here on the show notes or by going to celebrationbarreview.com/webinar. All right, everybody, have a great week. Hope everyone hangs in there. As we get more results in and more details, we'll share them with you, and we'll see you along the extra mile.
Thanks for listening to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at www.celebrationbarreview.com.